this is Daniel Ritchie, the developer of Howler, and I would like to show you some of the new tools we have in version 9.5 that will be useful to texture artists, perhaps video game developers, or those working in 3D, especially for working with landscapes, but probably for other types of texturing as well. We have a number of new filters going in, and also features going into the 3D designer that can be exported as texture maps, and I'd like to show you those now. As you see on my screen, we have a landscape that's been textured, lit, and rendered inside the program, and Howler does excel at working with height maps. We're not necessarily a 3D texturing program per se, but we can do a number of texturing duties inside the program. I'd like to show you the texture that I've used for this 3D object, which I have in my swap image, which, as you probably know by now, is sort of like drawing on the back side of the paper. We call it the swap image. It used to be called the swap buffer, but people did not like the terminology, so we just went ahead and said, okay, it's just a word, we'll just call it the swap image. So we go there by pressing J on the keyboard for jump, or this button that looks like kind of a squiggly S on the top left, or sorry, top right. Always confuse my left and right. I spent too many years sitting in front of a computer where left and right were completely reversed using Lightwave 3D. Anyways, I'm going to go to the swap image, and we have, as you see here, we have this landscape texture, which is represents quite a bit of detail, quite a bit of information. Actually, we have a some weathering going on, some of this erosion that you see as part of the texture. We see different colors, which might represent snow or different types of rock strata, which is based on slope and altitude. We have shadows that are baked into this texture. So if you're working in a 3D or video game environment, you might want to have those as options, because it's quicker for the program to render those things if they're already baked into the texture than it would be to do lighting on the fly in the renderer. So these are some features that would be very useful to those types of artists working in games, or even in 3D where you need to save some rendering time. Not everybody has those 15 hours of frame that Pixar and DreamWorks are using. Not everybody. Yeah, I think when we were working on Roughnecks Chronicles, we had about 2 minutes per frame to work with, but we never actually got that much render love on the stack usually. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I created this texture. I'm going to start by showing you some of the different aspects of this texture map. So let me store a copy of this so we can go back to it. Go to image and store image copy. I'll move this over here. I'll start by showing you the this height map, which we generated just by using plasma noise on 2 different layers. We also have an erosion map, which we made it inside the program. Under filters and Stylize, there's a filter to do that called the erosion filter, which if you go there, it has some parameters you can put in there. But it also exists under the 3D designer, which is where we created this one, and we exported it as an image map. Alright, so let me also show you, we also have a lighting map, which we exported from 3D designer, and another lighting map, which represents 2 different lights. It will export each light inside the program independently, so you can combine them later. Combining them is simple enough. You might, if you're a Photoshop user, you might think of using layers to do that, and we do have layers, but even quicker, you could just click on the stored image, the options, and combine, and there's an add mode, and as you can see, since lights are additive, that gives you a accurate representation of combining 2 lights, basically, into one image map. And that represents one key light that has some shadows on it, and the shadows are baked into the texture. That's optional. And we also have this fill light that represents sort of a top-down light that we wanted to fill in some of these details. So I might store a copy of that come back to that later perhaps. We also have this texture map that we created by using the slope filter, which is part of 3D Designer, but it also exists by itself under the Stylize menu, slope shading, and there's some parameters extra. There are a few extra options than what you see in the 3D Designer, but that exists standalone if you're just wanting to create the textures, or if you want to work in a 3D environment, you can do that from the 3D Designer as well. We also have, let's see, the erosion map I was talking about earlier. We combined the two. So let me go back to that original texture, add a layer. I'm going to bring up that erosion map. I'm going to invert it because we want to subtract it or multiply it with the texture map. So I'm going to go ahead and invert this, and I'm going to fade it out by using, since I'm on a layer, I'm going to use this little fader here that will let me fade this in and out. And I'll put it right about there, and let's think, is there anything else I want to add to this while I'm at it? Probably not, at least on a layer. Let me go ahead and merge these. There's a button that merges those on the layers panel. Hit OK. This might be where I want to add my lighting, so I'll go ahead and add a layer there. And as you remember, we combined those two layer maps into one. I'll go ahead and click that to bring that up on that layer. As you see, they're now combined. Using the multiply mode is the correct mode to use for when combining these lights onto a texture map. As you can see, I'll fade it out. There's our original texture with the erosion, and there it is with the lights. All right. So one thing I noticed is these shadows are a little bit hard, so I might just blur that a little bit. Simple blur will do the job. Hit OK, and we're basically coming to a point where we have a very usable texture map for a video game. There are some other details you could add. You might want to go into convolutions and do a little bit of sharpening, or what might look kind of nice would be an an emboss, like color emboss. Or, let me see, we could also, well, that's a good enough start for now. I'm going to hit merge these two layers, and let's see, I think there was one other thing we did. Yes, there was. I'm going to go ahead and add one more layer and add in this right here, the original height map. I'm going to click that, and if I make this bottom layer invisible, you'll see that we have just the height map in a layer by itself. The combine mode is multiply for now. I think I'll keep that on multiply. I'll go to filter, stylize, and ambient occlusion, and this will simulate the lighting from, or at least the shadowing from, lights that are not direct sunlight, but lights that are all around, such as bounce light and that sort of thing. And it's sort of a top-down effect. So if you have a height map, the parts of the height map that are higher will receive more light than the ones that are lower, because they are likely to be more occluded in it, and there's a radius and some other parameters of how far you want to search in each direction. So it's not a very global effect, it's local to a certain radius around each pixel. There's a number of samples. It does actually do sampling, just like ambient occlusion in a 3D program would do. 200 usually is a very smooth value, but 32 is good enough for our purposes. We just generated that ambient occlusion map. It's a little bit blurry, so I might go ahead and just or a little bit grainy, so I might go ahead and blur it a little bit. Hit OK. I'll turn that visibility back on that bottom layer, and now you can see we have our texture map with ambient occlusion already baked into it. I'll fade it out slightly because we don't want it quite that dark, and then I will merge those two layers. And as you see, we have just reproduced more or less that texture map we've been using on our 3D object. I'll go ahead and store a copy of that because we might want to come back to it, which is running out of screen space, which is right there. Now I will go back to the swap screen, as you remember, pressing J on the keyboard or this button up at the top, and And as you can see, this is the image we rendered. I'm going to go ahead and show you how we did some of that. I will clear this. Actually, I don't need to clear it. I'll just go ahead and go back to our original height map and go into 3D Designer. Transform and 3D Designer. Alright, as you can see, since I still have those parameters I was using before, we have a pretty good idea of what that's going to look like using that texture and everything. I will now go ahead and turn off some of these parameters, so I'll turn off Ambient Occlusion and some other things, so we can get a better look at how we created this. I'm going to turn off ground fog, and we don't have shadows on. Those are actually part of the texture. You can see this somewhat soft edge shadow right here, some being cast from these rocks over here. That is actually baked into the height map. I'm going to turn off, for now I'm going to turn off fog, and let me turn off all but one light. I'm going to make this light sort of a top-down light, and I'm going to make it white for now. Okay, a little bit bright. Alright, as you can see, even with just this one bland looking light, we have a lot of detail in this image. That is all coming from that texture map that we created. If we did not have the texture map, this would look very dull. In fact, it's almost white. Let me take the brightness down. And you can see that's very uninteresting looking. Just a simple plain color image. Very generic 3D lighting. I think there's some specular highlights on the surface, but that's about it. I'll go ahead and turn that texture from the swap image back on and put that light back up a bit. And as you can see, this is a very detailed looking surface, and it's all in the texture map. This can be very useful for, as I said, for game developers who don't do lighting on the fly. It's actually baked into the surface, or for other uses.